This is a book review of The Flaw in All Magic by Ben S. Dobson. This was one of those books that had so much going for it and one major flaw. Ironic, I know, given the title, right? On the one hand, in its favor, this book showed how you can take a bunch of tropes, mush them together, and come up with something that feels new, original, deep, and juicy. When I say juicy, it's a compliment, in case you can't tell. I use that term a lot. I don't know where I got it from. So imagine Sherlock Holmes was summoned to Hogwarts, which is located in Middle-earth. Three elements which by themselves are not necessarily original, but mushed all together, they came up into a new world that I felt very comfortable in, and yet felt like I'd never seen it quite this way before. The other reason that it really worked, even though there were a lot of elements that were kind of familiar from fantasy, mages, elves, orcs, gnomes, a magic university, lots of familiar elements, and yet the setting was perfect because what we were really here to do was have a mystery. This book followed the tropes of the detective genre to a T. It starts with a murder. The trope of the hero here is also pretty familiar, and yet it's one of those tropes that's always fun. He's that guy who has the sleight of hand, who's very clever, a little too clever for his own good, who's always one step ahead, thinking not with his muscles, but with his brain of everybody else. He's the trickster guy. He's the coyote. He's not a literal coyote in this book, but he's that coyote trope of the trickster, the clever one. And of course, that's a perfect person to be for a detective because he's also got this really logical mind. And in fact, all the magic in this book is approached through this very rigorous, logical, almost scientific approach, which also helps make the entire world really unique and really stand out despite all the seemingly familiar tropes that we see. In fact, there's kind of a steampunk feel to it because their magic is so advanced and so sort of scientific in the approach of it that they have things that are like floating platforms like trains, and the centerpiece of the entire mystery, the thing around the MacGuffin sort of around which the murder mystery revolves, is apparently some kind of giant blimp, but a blimp that runs on magic. And so they really do, the author Ben Dobson really does a great job explaining the magic and all the rules about it. And that's really important because the whole premise of the book is that magic has to follow rules. It's almost like a computer following a code. In fact, the magic is very, very similar, very analogous to doing coding for computers, which means that the main character, who doesn't have any magic himself, he's not a mage, but he understands the logic of a spell. And so he can read a spell, he knows how to read it, and he knows how to anticipate what it's going to do. And he wants to advocate for all people like himself, who are people without magic, but who should be able to understand the rules of magic so that they can read spells and see if the machines they're using that are supposed to implement these spells will do what they're supposed to do. But the traditional understanding of magic in this society is that only people who are born with magic, who are mages, particularly who come from magical races, only they can do magic and only they deserve to study it. So he has kind of a chip on his shoulder. He has kind of something to prove because when they found out he didn't have any magic, he got kicked out of the magic university. But now he's back and he wants to prove himself, and also it's a friend of the love interest in the story who was murdered, so he also has a personal stake in solving this murder. His partner is on the cover. I thought it was supposed to be a male elf, but I guess that just shows my bias because it's supposed to be some kind of female ogre thing or orc. I guess that's supposed to be an orc. Anyway, she's a very funny character. She's a great sidekick, and I can see this being a great series. This is the setup, I think, for a series called The Mage Breakers, and I could even see this being a television series. It's got that very episodic structure to it, and I can just see this being like, these two detectives getting together, and then his girlfriend is now like the police inspector, and it's a great setup for a magical detective series. All of those elements I love, and I really enjoyed the characters. I related to the main character, and I liked all the side characters. All of these elements were great. So unfortunately, that made it all the more disappointing that there was a flaw at the heart of the book. And that was a pretty big flaw because this book's main claim to fame, not to fame, but its main claim to storyline, the thing that was driving the story mainly was the detective story. So it had to work as a detective story. It had to work as a murder mystery. Unfortunately, it didn't, at least in my opinion. I'm going to say why, but there's going to be spoilers. So if you don't want to have any spoilers, Definitely still a fun book to read. I did enjoy reading the book. I just wish it didn't have this one flaw that I'm going to discuss in a minute. So if you want to give it a read before you find out, because it will spoil the mystery, just stop this review right now and you can go get the book and read it for yourself and then come back to it if you want to see if I agreed with what you thought about it. Okay, so here's the problem that I had with it. It was super obvious who did. There were 2 clues right in the beginning, and either one of those clues alone would have been enough for me to guess who did it. The fact that we got them in quick succession just made it worse. Then the clues just kept piling on. They all pointed to the same person. It was super obvious. Literally nobody else had a motive for it. I was hoping so much that the obvious candidate would be a red herring and that the writer was going to be a little more sophisticated, and the writer was leading me down a garden path and then was going to yank the rug out of my suppositions at the last minute and say, ha ha ha, you thought it was that guy, but it wasn't. Okay, so this is where I'm going to talk about it more in depth because I think it really went wrong and I want to explain why I think that. This is really your last chance to bow out before spoilers. There's 2 kind of guilty parties in this. One is the guy who actually committed the murder, and he's the fall guy for the real villain who set up the murder and really used the magic that enabled it. There's literally only one other person who's ever really seriously considered as a suspect, and that's the mentor, the lovable mentor of the hero. So I could never believe that she was actually responsible. In fact, the only thing that even made me mildly suspect her is because so many mysteries will take a likable character and mess with you by making them the murderer, which I don't like either, by the way. But if you take your mustachioed villain who's literally in the corner cackling with his black cape and twirling his mustache, that also doesn't work. The world building in this story is that there was in the past history, there was an evil mage who tried to take over the main continent of the world and dominate it with magic users and suppress all the non-magic users. He was overthrown and all the magical races escaped to a new kind of society, a tolerant society that would be open to all different kinds of people and also open to magic, and to show their neighbors that they weren't trying to follow in the footsteps of this evil mage supremacist, sort of mage Nazi, shall we say. They have one rule, which is that they have to have a democratically elected leader who is not a mage. By complete coincidence, the democratically elected leader at this time is a dark-skinned woman. And I'm sure that was not at all because of an attempt to be at the top of the progressive stack. Total coincidence. Also, by total coincidence, the chief suspect is an elf, clearly played by a white male actor with a British accent, someone like Jacek Isaac or Hugo Weaving. He's a complete snob, he's a super powerful mage, he's really intelligent, he looks down on other races. Oh yeah, and he has a statue dedicated to the mage Nazi emperor in his office. Gosh, he didn't look suspicious at all. I mean, come on. It just was too over the top. It was so obvious this was the bad guy. You know, it's really hard once you put Nazis, any kind of metaphorical Nazis into your story, and then you tell us that one of the super powerful people in your story who has the ability, who has the motive, and who has the opportunity to commit the murder, which is also motivated by mage Nazi motives, it's probably gonna be obvious that he's the bad guy. That just doesn't come as a surprise. It also made him a really transparent, cardboard character. The other characters in this were really well done, but this guy came straight out of central casting, and the minute he was on stage twirling his mustache, he didn't have a mustache, but you knew he was gonna be the bad guy. It would have been so awesome if I had been wrong, if this had been the red herring. Like, you laid the path, like, here's what stereotypically you would think would be the villain, but aha! I tricked you. It's really this other completely also fits the clues character that I introduced cleverly throughout the book and you never noticed because it didn't fit the stereotype. But that didn't happen. It fit the stereotype. It was really transparent. It kind of ruined the whole book because it's supposed to be a mystery, and it made me kind of cautious to buy other books in the series. On the one hand, I thought, well, maybe this is a one-off because maybe the mysteries will get better. They just wanted to, the author just wanted to start with something more about building the world and establishing the villainous group and the kind of moral good and evil system that he wanted to showcase. And I'm okay with that. I don't have a problem with, metaphorical Nazis being in the book, but I am a little leery of, is this going to be the outcome in every single book to come? Because apparently there is this society of mage supremacists who are up to shenanigans. And then the hero starts a new organization at the end of the book called the Mage Breakers, and there's a new case that's presented at the end, which I liked. I loved that ending. I liked the setup for the next book. I liked the setup for the series. but I want to know that this is going to be a series where I can't just predict every single ending just based on what I know of political correctness. There was a TV series, Lie to Me, which is based on a real life person who talks about micro expressions and stuff like that, and I was familiar with the real book, The Real Person, and the real research on micro expressions. So although mystery isn't my main genre, I do watch some, and I started to watch that series. But it was so predictable. It was so predictable because all you had to do is know your basic rules of political correctness and know the progressive stack and who's on top. And you always knew who the villain was going to be. You always knew who was the innocent victim. You always knew who was the falsely accused because they just never varied from stereotypes. So that is just, to me, that just killed it. It's supposed to be a mystery. I could already guess within the first 5 minutes of the show every plot point and exactly who was actually guilty. Sadly, that was the same case in this otherwise really, really well done book. I don't know if the second book in the series is out yet. It will be called The Mask of the Emperor, I believe. If you've made it this far and this kind of thing doesn't bother you, then by all means read the book. If my spoiling it hasn't bothered you, then by all means read the book. I don't know yet if I'm going to read the second book in this series. Tara out.